Imagine receiving a letter, a simple letter, but within its words lies someone's fate, the fate of a life. What if that letter predicted the death of someone you love? Would you ignore it or try to change the future? Ethan, our protagonist, is about to discover that some messages cannot be erased, and the price to alter the course of fate may be greater than anyone can imagine. Get ready to dive into a story where time is the enemy and choices can either doom or free you. It was a morning like any other for Ethan. He was 23, lived in a small town, and was just beginning to build his career at a local company. Life was going its usual course, simple, until that day. When he opened his front door to pick up the newspaper, he found something unusual, an old, worn-out letter with his name handwritten on it. There was no sender, just a stamp that seemed to date from a distant time. Curious and slightly intrigued, Ethan opened the letter, thinking it might be a mistake or a prank from a friend. But what he read made his heart race. "In 7 days you will die." The letter was short, direct, and disturbing. The date was clearly marked, and the deadline was precise. Within a week, his life would end. Ethan laughed nervously. Surely, it was a bad joke. Someone was trying to scare him, and he was determined not to give it any importance. Still, something about the way the words were written and the strange feeling surrounding the paper left a mark on his mind. He tried to convince himself that there was nothing to worry about, but the unsettling feeling persisted. The first few days passed without incident, and Ethan began to forget about the letter. But on the third day, something changed. It happened while he was at work, typing on his computer. His phone rang, and a soft, deep voice on the other end said only one sentence: 3 days. Ethan froze. Whoever was on the other end hung up before he could respond or ask anything. A chill ran down his spine. He began to feel watched. As he left work, he had the sensation that someone was following him, though when he looked around, no one was there. Paranoia began to set in. The letter, which had once seemed like a joke, now haunted him. And that phone call? How did they know exactly how many days were left? Determined to find out the truth, Ethan went to the local police station. He told the officer on duty the story, but the reaction was predictable. The officer laughed, saying they had seen many similar pranks in the town. "Probably a teenager trying to scare you," he said, dismissing the case. Ethan left the station more frustrated than relieved. No one was taking him seriously. On the 5th day, things started to get worse. Ethan was awakened in the middle of the night by a loud noise coming from the kitchen. Upon investigating, he found all the cabinets open, and objects that were once neatly organized seemed to be thrown across the floor. Stranger still, there were no signs of forced entry or any evidence that someone had been there. And then he saw it. A second letter, exactly like the first, placed in the center of the kitchen table. 2 days. This time, the feeling of dread was palpable. Ethan began to feel that something supernatural was happening. But how? And why? The letter was clearly warning him of something, and now he knew it wasn't just a prank. Every part of his house started to feel threatening. The lights flickered, shadows seemed to move around the corners of the rooms, and time, which had once passed unnoticed, now seemed to be speeding toward the fateful date. Desperate, Ethan decided to call his closest friends, but none of them answered. He wasn't sure if it was coincidence or if, somehow, they too were being affected by this curse. Certain he needed help, Ethan remembered an old college friend, a private investigator named Nick, who always had a fascination with strange and unusual cases. On the 6th day, Ethan called him, begging for help. Nick, intrigued by the story, decided it was worth investigating. Nick arrived at Ethan's house that same night. The atmosphere was heavy, as if something invisible hung in the air, threatening to reveal itself at any moment. Together, they revisited the letter, tried to trace possible suspects, but nothing seemed to make sense. Nick, ever the skeptic, suggested they might be dealing with a skilled stalker, perhaps someone who had deeply studied Ethan's life. However, as the investigation progressed, coincidences and inexplicable events began to emerge that defied all logic. While Nick was searching Ethan's house for clues, a third letter appeared. It was on the coffee table in the living room, as if it had been placed there at that very moment, without anyone noticing. One day, the third letter was the breaking point for Ethan. One day, only 24 hours to figure out what was happening and how to avoid the worst. He looked at Nick, who was trying to stay calm, but the tension was palpable. The silence in the house seemed even more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around them. Nick, despite his initial skepticism, could not ignore the strange events he had witnessed. The letters, the unexplained noises, and Ethan's behavior made him question everything he knew about logic and reason. "There's something here, Ethan," he said, trying to hide his own unease. "This isn't just a coincidence. Someone is watching us." The two decided to spend the night together, thoroughly investigating the house and monitoring everything around them. But as the hours passed, the sense of impending danger only increased. The lights began to fail again, shadows moved around the corners, and the silence was broken by strange noises, like whispers. In the middle of the night, something happened. A loud knock echoed on the front door. Ethan froze, feeling his heart almost stop in his chest. Nick went to the door, holding a flashlight. When he opened it, there was no one. Just one last letter, carefully placed on the ground. Midnight. Now it was a matter of hours. The final letter had sealed Ethan's fate, or so it seemed. What would happen at midnight? Would he die in some horrible way? Would it be an accident, a trap? All he knew was that he needed to do something to stop what was coming. Nick, determined not to leave Ethan alone, suggested they leave the house and go to a public place where they would be surrounded by people. The idea was that if someone was behind this, it would be harder to act in public. They drove to a 24-hour diner in town where they could stay alert and try to prevent any attack. But with every second that passed, the clock ticked, reminding them of the impending deadline. Ethan looked at the clock in the diner, 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until midnight. The diner was practically empty, except for an elderly couple at a distant table and the waiter, who seemed completely unaware of what was happening. Nick ordered coffee and kept an eye on all the entrances. But as midnight approached, a chill settled in the air. The clock read 11:58 p.m., and Ethan began to feel a growing pressure in his chest, as if something invisible was squeezing his heart. Then, at 11:59 p.m., the restaurant lights flickered. Ethan's wristwatch stopped, and in the distance, the sound of a bell broke the silence. The bell rang throughout the town, like a sinister announcement. Ethan and Nick looked at each other, panic rising. They knew something was about to happen, but they didn't know what. The waiter, confused, went to the door to see who could be there, as the restaurant wasn't used to receiving visitors late at night. He opened the door, but there was no one. Nick began to move, trying to think of a way out, but Ethan was paralyzed. He felt a strange force around him, as if something was about to collapse over his head. The restaurant clock struck midnight. The hour had come. Suddenly, everything around them seemed to stop. The elderly couple froze in their chairs, the waiter stood motionless at the door, and even the air seemed dense and still. Ethan heard a voice, not Nick's, nor anyone he knew. It was a low, hoarse, distant voice that echoed in his mind. "Time is up." Ethan's heart raced. He felt as if he were trapped, unable to move. Nick grabbed his arm, but there was no way out of the situation. Something invisible was taking over. Death surrounded him, and there was nowhere to run. And then, everything stopped. The sound, the movement, even Ethan's breath seemed suspended in the air. For a moment, he thought it was the end. But suddenly, the environment around them returned to normal. The elderly couple was moving again, the waiter shifted, and the restaurant's ambient noise returned. However, Ethan still felt the weight of that voice. Nick stood next to him, confused. "What was that?" he asked, but Ethan didn't know how to answer. He looked at the restaurant clock. It was 12:01 a.m. Midnight had passed, and he was still alive. But instead of relief, he felt a sense of unease. Something was wrong. Though he was alive, he felt that something was behind it, something he didn't fully understand. Then the waiter returned with a new letter, placed directly on Ethan's table. "This just arrived," he said, without seeming concerned. Ethan opened the letter with trembling hands. "You have been spared for now." Terror flooded his body once again. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The new letter reopened the wounds of fear in Ethan. "Spared "For now" echoed in his mind like a sinister warning. He had survived midnight, but what did it mean? Nick, seeing Ethan's state, suggested they return to his house rather than staying at the restaurant. They needed a safe place to process everything and maybe figure out what to do next. On the way back, the silence between them was almost as heavy as the fear Ethan felt. Nick, ever the rational one, tried to come up with an explanation, but even he began to doubt what was real and what wasn't. The town was deserted, the streets dark, with only the faint glow of streetlights illuminating their way back. When they arrived at Ethan's house, the atmosphere was different. It was as if the house, which once seemed safe, was now shrouded in an aura of tension and danger. Upon entering, Ethan noticed that everything was the same as before, but he couldn't feel at home. Every shadow seemed to hide something, every noise made him jump. Determined to find answers, Ethan and Nick decided to review all the letters they had received so far. Nick believed that maybe there was some pattern or code hidden in the words, something that could indicate who was behind it all. They spread the letters out on the kitchen table and began to examine each one closely. The words "in 7 days," 3 days, 1 day, and finally, midnight were written flawlessly, as if they had been meticulously planned. Nothing in the letters gave an obvious clue as to who wrote them, but one thing stood out. The paper seemed very old, as if it had been kept for years before being delivered. Ethan didn't know what it meant, but Nick, with his analytical mind, began to form a theory. What if it's not just a threat? What if this is part of something bigger, something that transcends time? The idea seemed absurd, but after everything they had been through, no hypothesis was off the table. That night, as Ethan tried to sleep, a disturbing dream enveloped him. He was back on the road where it all began, but this time, he was completely alone. The town was dark and deserted, and he could hear the same hoarse, threatening voice whispering his name. He walked through the empty streets, trying to find a way out, but every corner he turned brought him back to the starting point. Suddenly, he saw a figure in the distance, standing at the town's entrance. It was a shadow, tall and indistinct, with bright red eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. The figure watched him, motionless, as if waiting for something. Ethan tried to run, but his feet were stuck to the ground, and the figure began to approach slowly, like a cloud of darkness engulfing everything around it. He woke up with a jolt, sweating. Nick, who was on the sofa nearby, also woke up. "Are you okay?" he asked, noticing Ethan's disturbed state. But Ethan could barely respond. The dream felt more real than anything he had ever experienced. The next day, Ethan decided he needed to dig deeper. It was clear that the letters were connected to something much older and more dangerous than he had imagined. He and Nick went to the local library, where they began researching similar events in the town's history. What they discovered left them even more perplexed. Decades ago, there were reports of a man who also received strange letters, warning him of his imminent death. The man, like Ethan, tried to ignore the warnings but mysteriously disappeared on the 7th day. No one ever heard from him again. Moreover, there were stories of other people who had disappeared without a trace over the years, all with some strange pattern involving time. The town seemed to have a history of unexplained events, but it had always been covered up, as if no one wanted to admit what was happening. Ethan felt a chill down his spine. He wasn't just dealing with a personal threat, but something rooted in the town's dark past. During their investigation, Nick found a reference to an old clock tower in the town center that, according to the oldest residents, had a connection to the mysterious deaths. The clock, which had long stopped working, was considered a symbol of bad luck. Many of the victims of the letters had been seen near the clock in the days leading up to their disappearance. Determined to find out more, Ethan and Nick went to the location. The clock tower was imposing, though in ruins. The gears were rusted, and the clock face was covered in moss, as if time had forgotten that place. However, there was something disturbingly hypnotic about the way the clock dominated the landscape. As they examined the structure, Nick noticed something strange. At the base of the tower, there were symbols carved into the stone, symbols they recognized from the letters Ethan had received. This wasn't a coincidence. Somehow, the clock was connected to the curse. As Ethan and Nick investigated the clock tower, a new detail came to light. Nick, always attentive, noticed a small opening at the base of the tower, covered by vegetation. When they cleared it, they discovered a passage leading to an old basement hidden beneath the structure. With flashlights in hand, they descended, feeling the cold, dense air around them. The basement was deeper than they expected, and the floor was covered in dust and debris. In the center of the subterranean room, there was a stone table with a series of old papers scattered on it. On top of the papers, there was one last letter, identical to those Ethan had received. Ethan opened the letter, his heart pounding. The message was short but clear. The cycle continues, and time cannot be stopped. You have been chosen to maintain the balance. Your life is just another part of this eternal game. Ethan and Nick stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of the revelation. Everything they had been through, all the letters, the voices, the nightmares, was connected to an endless cycle, a curse that used time as its main instrument. The town, the clock, the missing people, they were all pieces of a much larger game. Now, Ethan understood that his life was tied to this cycle, and the choice was not about escaping but about continuing. He didn't know if he could break the cycle, or if he was destined to be another piece in the curse's history. But one thing was certain. Time, that invisible enemy, was always lurking, ready to claim its next victim. What would happen next? Could Ethan change his fate, or was he forever trapped in this cruel game? He knew that time was against him, but this time, he was determined to fight. As Ethan absorbed the implications of the final letter, a low, rhythmic sound began to reverberate through the depths of the basement. It was a metallic sound, like the ticking of a clock, but much deeper and more threatening. The walls of the basement seemed to vibrate slightly with each tick, as if time itself was about to manifest physically. Nick, ever the rational one, looked around for a logical explanation, but there was nothing. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once. "We need to get out of here," he said, pulling Ethan by the arm. But before they could take a step, the dark figure Ethan had seen in his nightmares appeared at the basement door. The silhouette was indistinct, a mixture of shadow and human form, with the same bright red eyes that seemed to pierce Ethan's soul. The air around them grew colder, and Nick stepped back, his face pale with fear. The figure advanced slowly, but it didn't seem threatening in a traditional sense. It was simply there, watching. "You know what you must do," a voice echoed in Ethan's mind, clear as the sound of a bell. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but something inside him knew the figure was the timekeeper. This entity wasn't just a spectator. It was the enforcer of the curse, and now it was there to ensure the cycle continued. The keeper didn't say anything aloud, but Ethan understood what was being offered. He could escape the town if he was willing to sacrifice someone else to keep the cycle going. The keeper wanted only a new victim, someone to take Ethan's place in the endless cycle of death and rebirth. Ethan looked at Nick, his mind spinning with the impossibility of the decision. He could save his own life, but at what cost? He was trapped in a cruel choice. If he kept the cycle going, he would live, but at someone else's expense. If he tried to break it, he didn't know what would happen. And the keeper's presence, imposing and eternal, seemed to make it clear that breaking the cycle wasn't an option. "You can decide," the voice continued in his mind, "but time, as always, demands a payment." Ethan began to sweat, his mind racing for a way out. He knew he couldn't sacrifice Nick or anyone else, but he also knew that if he didn't make a choice, the town, the cycle, and the keeper would consume him. Slowly, the keeper took a step forward, extending a long, spectral hand toward Ethan. "Time does not wait," the voice whispered. The ground around them began to tremble, as if the very town was reacting to Ethan's hesitation. Nick, seeing the terror in Ethan's eyes, stepped back. "What's happening, Ethan? What are you thinking of doing?" Nick's voice was filled with desperation, and he realized his friend was facing an impossible dilemma, but without knowing what was really at stake. Ethan felt his hands tremble as the keeper continued to approach. The unspoken offer hung in the air. Sacrifice someone and free yourself from the curse. He knew the keeper wouldn't simply disappear if he refused. But even knowing this, Ethan couldn't make the choice. It was in that moment that he realized the only way to beat the cycle was not to play the game. He couldn't accept the rules imposed by the curse. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Nick and the keeper. "I'm not going to do it. I won't sacrifice anyone to escape." The keeper paused for a moment, the red eyes glowing brighter. The ticking of the clock echoed in the air, each second seeming heavier than the last. "So, you accept your fate," the voice whispered in his mind. Ethan knew that this was the consequence. By refusing the offer, he was accepting the burden of the cycle upon himself. But he preferred that to condemning someone else. He took another step forward, closer to the keeper, feeling the weight of his decision. "I accept," he said, his voice firm, but his eyes filled with fear. With Ethan's response, the keeper stood still for a long moment, as if considering his words. The ticking of the clock grew louder, each second sounding like a judge's gavel. Then, unexpectedly, the figure dissipated, like mist dissolving at sunrise. The air around them suddenly grew lighter, and the sound of the clock stopped. Ethan looked around, unable to believe what had just happened. The oppressive presence he had felt since the beginning was gone. Nick was in shock, but relieved to realize the threat had passed. Somehow, by refusing to play the game, Ethan had broken the cycle. The town, once dark and claustrophobic, seemed to have returned to normal. But Ethan knew he would never be the same. Something inside him had changed forever. Ethan and Nick left the town that same night, without looking back. The mystery of the letters, the keeper, and the cycle had been resolved, but the price Ethan paid was high. He had sacrificed himself in a way no one would ever fully understand. And now, I ask you, what would you do if you received a letter predicting the death of someone close? Do you believe that fate can be changed, or is it inevitable? Leave your comment below, and don't forget to like if the story gripped you until the end. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories that play with time, mystery, and the unknown. See you on the next journey.